Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Miles here. I actually just finished making this living moss terrarium for my new jumping spider, and I'm going to show you step by step, start to finish, how I did it. I'm also going to include all the stuff you'll need in the description. Don't worry, it's pretty much moss, just in case you don't know where to get stuff. But be sure to let me know if you end up having any questions in the comments, or if you actually end up making this yourself. I love reading that type of stuff. It means editing the video and filming it in the first place was actually worth it. Without further ado, let's get started.
Don't forget to subscribe, guys. It means so much. Thanks.
So the first step for me was actually to spider-proof, so to speak, this tower. So that means plugging all the holes, and then I made this little door. So to show you how I spider-proofed this little tower, just in case you need some help with this, I used some potting foam. At least I think that's what it's called. The stuff you stick like little fake flowers in. And I just pushed that into the various holes and, places that the spider could go hide, which we don't want. We want to be able to see our spider ideally at all times, just in case there's some kind of issue. And from there, I just took some wood and cut it into the shape of a door. And I hot glued that in place. Well, I hot glued the doorknob first and then let that dry. And I painted it with some fancy little craft paints I'll link in the description. They're actually really cool. I'm not like much of an arts and crafts person, but the door itself turned out like super awesome. I did the same for the windows. And, this might not apply to your setup, but just in case, just so you kind of have like a starting point, or if you want to just replicate what I did. And once I had all that, I hot glued the door and the window pieces of wood into place, and there we had our tower. The terrarium I got is actually really nice. It's made out of glass, which in my opinion is imperative. Whichever terrarium you go with, I can strongly recommend this one. Just be sure to get glass. You can't see out of acrylic that well, especially over time, and glass is just easier to clean. Now here, I was simply test fitting various things, including the tower. I also got these really awesome Japanese rocks. I forget what kind of rocks they are. I'll link them in the description. They're so pretty, but the ones that I got, I purchased them, I think, in small, the smallest they had, and they're still gigantic for this purpose. So unfortunately, I can't use them for this particular build, but they look amazing. Now, since we're using living moss, we need a really good substrate. So I'm using that aqua soil there, some charcoal, and a blend of peat moss. Now, the first step is to blend up the aqua soil. If you're not familiar, it comes in little pellets, so we've got to create a powder so we can use it later for the moss wall. And we're using this to essentially create like a soil glue. So we add some water, you'll see later, but just be sure you get it into a powder so it'll work properly. After that, we need to unpack our moss. So this is sheet moss as well as cushion moss. After you unpack the moss, it's a good idea to clean it off. And we do this by soaking it in some water. Be sure not to use tap water, ideally use distilled. In the video, I'm using bottled water. And the reason for this is it's actually bad to use tap water for your moss, as well as a jumping spider for that matter. And what we do, we dip it in, kind of like brush out the outside, gently of course, and you can see all that debris coming off. And this also serves to remove any hitchhikers that you don't want. You don't know if there's any bugs, creatures living in there, even at a really small scale. So this kind of gets them out of there. And a lot of people, I think, leave this overnight. I didn't personally, but you can leave it for a few hours, however long, just to be extra safe if you're concerned about that. Now, after it's done soaking, remove it, put it on a plate with some paper towels, and let it drain off. And you can see just how dirty the water was from me soaking this for a couple minutes. And look how awesome that moss looks. On the terrarium that I got, you can see that it has a rear vent. That's great and all for some applications, but since we're doing a moss wall, it's unnecessary. So I used a hot glue gun to plug it entirely. One thing you should do is to use some painter's tape to create a reference point for where the wall's gonna end and the ground's going to begin. And the reason for this is the terrarium will be laying flat on the ground, so your perception will be sort of different. So this just creates a simple reference point so you can focus on the task at hand. Now I'm also putting up the spider hide prior to putting any moss in, just so it's easier to work with and it doesn't get dirty. And with that, we're finally ready to get started. Our preparation is done. Now that all the prep is done, we can finally start putting our terrarium together. But contain that excitement for just a few moments longer, because there's one more really important step to do, and that's a dry fit. Think of it like a rough draft. We don't want to start typing our essay and say, oh, well, this sounds better over here, and then we're just going to remove this section entirely. That doesn't work. You don't want to do that with moss, okay? So it's worth taking a few extra moments. We don't need to be moving pieces of moss around after we set it into our soil glue, because that's going to end up getting really messy. It's going to make the terrarium in the end look a lot worse than it could have. So just be a little patient, take your time, and do a little test fit. And this isn't to say that you need to memorize each individual piece. Okay, this goes in the top right or whatever, but just get a general idea, okay? So you can go back in, fill in the gaps after, you'll see later on, but the point is, do a dry fit, you'll thank yourself later, and the end result will look much better. When you believe you're ready, did you do your test fit? No? Go do your test fit. What are you doing? Go back. Go back a step. After you've done your test fit, you're ready to get going. This is the most exciting part, because it starts to come together. So you're going to get a bowl with the soil that you've ground up, and be super generous here because you'll need a lot of soil. You'll see that a little water goes a long way. It'll flood the soil and it'll just become a soupy mess. Just stir it in, add more dirt as necessary, and what we're after is a thick paste. We don't want something runny or something super loose. Just add some more dirt, and if it gets too dry, add a little tiny splash of water. It's really easy to get it right. The soil itself is essentially a glue, so the same rules apply. The longer you take, the less adhesive it's going to be. This isn't going to dry out instantly, so you don't have to feel rushed, but just keep that in mind that you want to move with purpose. Also, it's very important to keep your hands clean. Don't be using your hands to place the soil, because then you'll get the moss dirty when placing it and it'll look terrible. I'm starting to put the soil in, so this is a good time to mention when it comes to my DIYs, anytime I'm doing a process, I feel like it's important, because it is a tutorial, to show it in its majority or its entirety. I'll trim out some redundancies as necessary here, but in order to learn, some people learn from seeing everything so they have the confidence going into a project. There's nothing worse than when you're watching a tutorial to see stuff edited out, especially if it's something you're wanting to tackle. Now, the way I view it is, as a viewer, you can't add in content for, like a step that you were confused about that only has a 2-second clip, but you can skip content if the step you feel confident about, you can skip ahead. So that's my mindset, but just know if you skip ahead, you're going to miss all my secret tips. With that said, let's continue. Mix more soil here if you need it to finish covering the back glass. If you look closely here, you'll notice that the layer that I'm applying isn't really thin. It's at least 2 millimeters thick, and the reason for this is really important. If you apply just a thin layer, the moss might initially stick, but when it dries, it'll just fall off. So be generous here, make sure you get enough of a layer that creates like a cushion and really glues that moss in place. So when it dries, you're not gonna have any issues. Use the back of the spoon to spread it evenly, and when you're happy with your work, we can move to the next step. Now the exciting parts finally begin. It's gonna start taking shape really quickly, and it's so fun. We're gonna build the moss wall. The first step is to place your centerpiece. For me, it's that tower I showed you earlier, dead center in the middle, right where that painter's tape is, because that's where the ground's gonna be. You don't want it floating in the air. This isn't, what is it? Freaking Castle in the Sky. If you haven't seen that anime, it's amazing. But anyway, sorry, back to the terrarium. So when you're placing the moss, press gently and slide it gently side to side so it gets a really firm adhesion to the soil. Don't be too rough with it because it is fragile, but also be aware that your tower or whatever centerpiece isn't going to be stuck down as well. You can see it kind of move there. So just be aware of that, hold it in place with your other hand while you're placing pieces of the moss. Right now, I'm just kind of building as I go. I'm looking at the shape of the moss and the space that I've got available, and I'm placing accordingly. Try to keep the pieces close together, but don't sweat any kind of gaps that much. It's not that important right now. The main thing that we're doing is getting the general moss wall complete. We can go back later, break off smaller pieces, and fill those gaps. It's really important to keep your hands clean. Don't touch the soil because you'll dirty the moss and the tower or your centerpiece, and then it'll look terrible. So you don't want to do that. If you get dirt on your hands, be sure to rinse it off with water. As your wall begins to take shape, you're going to have to be more selective with what pieces will work. Some of them simply aren't going to fit without being torn, which tearing is okay. Just try to minimize it so it looks more natural. Also, be sure to look at your wall from every angle. Just looking at it from one place, the place that you've been working, you're bound to miss a gap. And right now, you need to finish it before that soil dries because that's your glue. You don't want to notice it later on after you're done and say, oh crap, I missed that spot. So just take a little extra time to look at it from every angle and make sure you didn't miss a spot. We've got a few more pieces to go here. Some really small, like this one here, and others a little bit bigger that we've got to still trim down. And with cushion moss, you'll notice that some of the pieces almost have flat sides. So try to use those in the corners especially. So that way you don't have a rounded shape at the top. And even if you do, you can still fill it with a smaller piece, but it just looks cleaner if you can find suitable pieces for the placement. Now I'm looking it over once more, and I think, oh, there's still one more piece, see? Take your time. I was fitting in this last piece, I saw a little tiny gap on the side of the tower. It's always exciting when you get to this point because you know this piece is the last one. It's like a puzzle, the last puzzle piece. And then, with that, your moss wall is done. How does that look? Now it's time for the final step, and that's to do the substrate. Now you need to be careful here when you're placing the charcoal on the base. We don't want too much, and we don't want too little, because this is what's going to make any kind of like excess water kind of be able to dry out and be absorbed by the charcoal. But the key here is I put in some along the back wall so I can feel comfortable with raising this whole thing upright. Your moss should stick fine, but I was mainly concerned about my centerpiece, the little tower there, and it ended up sticking fine, but just be careful. One thing that I didn't do is I didn't make sure that there was enough dirt in the back corners. So just be sure you do that. There's a little gap, it's not a big deal, but just keep an eye on all the corners as you do this. Now, when I stood it upright, you saw me using some paper towels. I was drying off some excess water that drained down. Just be sure you don't get, a whole bunch of excess water in your substrate right as you make it. Make sure everything's as dry as you can get it. So here you can see I added in a nice layer of charcoal. Now I'm adding in the peat moss mix. And be sure you keep this kind of thin, because we're putting on the aqua soil, which is like really nutrient rich for the moss after this. So here I'm adding the aqua soil. So we've got 3 layers. We've got the aqua soil, the peat moss, and then the charcoal. And then from here, we're going to create our little pathway up to the tower. Decorative, of course, with some rocks. I've linked those in the description, and they worked out great. And then what we're going to do, we're going to do a light mist to kind of, you know, get that adhesion for the moss to sit in. And we're going to start making our moss floor. Now here you've got a lot less space to work with, so you have to be a lot more selective with your pieces. But it's not as crucial as doing the moss wall. You know, you're able to kind of just fit 2 or 3 pieces in and you're there. Just be sure you try to keep the pieces as whole as possible. You don't have to be exact, but you also don't want 30 pieces within, you know, a few inch area. And the same rule applies here. We just press it in, wiggle it back and forth lightly, and we're good. And you can see I actually missed a little gap by the tower that I didn't notice before. I end up filling that in as well. Now we've just got this right side to go. I'm looking for the right piece. So many decisions. Actually, this is where I'm filling in that spot that you can see. I'm kind of back buttering the little moss since there's no soil on that portion of the wall, and I'm just pressing it in. Now when you do this, you have to be extra careful, because if you get that kind of dirt on the moss itself, it's really difficult to get off and it'll just look really bad. So just keep that in mind throughout the whole thing. You want to make sure that like the dirt glue, the soil glue, you don't get on any of the green parts of the moss. I did it on my first build and it wasn't the best looking and it never went away. So we're literally almost done. The finishing touch is here. And I think that actually might be the last piece. And we're adding springtails in. I didn't mention that, but it's really important just to help with any kind of like mold issues. They really do the dirty work for you. And with that, we can say that our living moss terrarium is complete. We've added in our little jumping spider accessories. They make, you know, some little ladders, some platforms, whatever you want to put in there is great. And it looks really awesome compared to the last one I did, so I'm really glad that I made this tutorial. I hope I helped you guys out. If I did, be sure to leave that like, comment, let me know your thoughts on the terrarium. Also, be sure to let me know if you tackle this yourself, you know, based on this video tutorial, because that means editing the video to begin with was worthwhile. So with that said, good luck on your build, and I will see you guys in the next one.